The ocean was not behaving. It was a gray, heaving monster. 30-foot waves crashed over the bow of the USS Hornet, turning the flight deck into a slippery death trap. The wind howled at 40 knots, tearing at the parkas of the deck crew. And sitting there, trembling against the wheel chocks, was a B-25 bomber. It didn't belong here. It was a land-based beast, heavy and wide. It was never designed to leave a carrier. The runway was too short, the plane was too heavy, and the sea was trying to swallow them whole. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten, gritty reality of history's toughest moments, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep these stories alive. April 18, 1942. The Pacific Theater. The United States was bleeding. Pearl Harbor was a fresh, open wound. The Philippines had fallen. The Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable, an expanding ink stain across the map of the Pacific. Morale back home was shattered. America needed a win. It needed to prove that the enemy was not untouchable. So they devised a plan that madness would reject. They stripped 16 medium bombers of their guns and armor. They loaded them with extra fuel tanks until the fumes alone were enough to make you dizzy. And they put 80 men on a carrier, sailing straight into the heart of the Japanese defensive perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle sat in the cockpit of the lead plane. The vibration of the twin Wright Cyclone engines rattled his teeth. The instrument panel was a blur of shaking needles. He wasn't just the commander. He was the test subject. If he failed, the other 15 planes would be pushed overboard to clear the deck for the ship's fighters. The air smelled of salt spray and high-octane gasoline. It was a sickening chemical mix. Rain lashed against the plexiglass. The carrier pitched violently, the bow dipping deep into the troughs of the waves, then heaving upward toward the gray sky. Doolittle watched the launch officer, a man fighting to stand upright in the gale. He held a flag, waiting for the ship to sink with the ocean. "Colonel, the deck is pitching too hard," his co-pilot said, his voice tight over the intercom. "Watch the flag," Doolittle replied. "Just watch the flag." They weren't supposed to be launching yet. That was the first problem. The plan was to get within 400 miles of Japan, launch at dusk, bomb at night, land in China by morning. But fate had other ideas. Hours earlier, a Japanese patrol boat had spotted the task force. The radio operator on the Hornet had intercepted the warning transmission. The element of surprise was evaporating by the second. They were 650 miles out, 200 miles further than planned. That meant 200 miles of extra fuel they didn't have. One of the pilots wrote in his logbook just before climbing in, "The math doesn't care about bravery. We are launching into a dead zone. I don't expect to see another sunrise." The alarm had sounded across the ship. "Army pilots, man your planes!" Now Doolittle revved the engines to full power. The B-25 shuddered, straining against the brakes. The noise was deafening, a physical weight pressing on the chest of every sailor on deck. The launch officer timed the wave. The bow of the Hornet plunged down, burying itself in green water. Then, slowly, the massive steel beast began to rise. The flag dropped. Doolittle released the brakes. The bomber didn't shoot forward. It lumbered. It was sluggish, burdened by 2,000 pounds of bombs and twice the normal fuel load. The wheels groaned over the wooden flight deck. The white line down the center of the deck rushed beneath them. The end of the deck was coming too fast. They weren't fast enough. Pull up, the co-pilot shouted. Jimmy, pull up. Not yet, Doolittle gritted out. He held the nose down, waiting for the last possible inch. The carrier's bow reached the peak of its rise, catapulting the plane upward. Doolittle hauled back on the yoke. The B-25 left the deck. It sank immediately toward the waves. The landing gear skimmed the whitecaps. Salt spray coated the windshield. For a terrifying second, the plane hung between flight and crash. Then, the wings caught the heavy, wet air. They climbed. One by one, 15 more bombers followed. One by one, they fought gravity, and won. They turned west, toward Tokyo. The flight was a nightmare of silence and noise. The drone of the engines was constant, hypnotic. But inside the cockpit, the silence was heavy. There was no radio chatter. They were running under strict silence to avoid detection. Just the endless gray ocean rolling beneath them. Hours passed. The fuel gauges dropped, needles creeping toward the red. They were flying low, 50 feet off the water, to stay under the radar. It felt like flying inside a tunnel. Then the gray turned to green. Land. They swept over the coast of Japan. It wasn't a fortress of steel. It was peaceful. Farmers looked up from their fields, waving, thinking these were their own plains. The sun was out now. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Doolittle climbed to 1,200 feet. The sprawling city of Tokyo lay beneath them. It looked fragile, a city of wood and paper. Open the bomb bay doors, Doolittle ordered. Doors open, the bombardier confirmed. The wind howled louder as the belly of the plane opened up. Below them, factories, shipyards, and military complexes drifted into the crosshairs. The anti-aircraft fire began. Black puffs of smoke blossomed around them. The plane bucked. "They're waking up!" the gunner yelled from the back. "Steady," Doolittle said. "Drop them." The aircraft jumped as the weight released. 4 incendiary bombs whistled down. Seconds later, the ground erupted. Plumes of smoke and fire tore through the industrial districts. It wasn't about the damage. The physical damage was minimal compared to what would come later in the war. It was the message. The emperor had promised his people that their island was divine, untouchable. The sky was supposed to be theirs. Now, American shadows were passing over the imperial palace. They didn't stay to watch the fires. They dove back down to the treetops, engines screaming, racing for the open sea on the other side of the island. They had poked the hornet's nest, and now they had to run. But the hardest part wasn't the raid. It was the escape. They crossed the Sea of Japan toward China. The weather turned again. A storm front, massive and black, stood between them and safety. Darkness fell. The fuel gauges were tapping empty. They were supposed to land at designated airfields in unoccupied China. Homing beacons were supposed to guide them in, but the plane carrying the beacons had never made it. The ground below was pitch black. No lights, no runway, just jagged mountains and Japanese patrols. Rain hammered the fuselage. Visibility was zero. Doolittle looked at his crew. The engines sputtered. One caught, then died. The prop feathered, spinning lazily to a stop. "We're out," Doolittle said. His voice was calm, unnaturally calm. "Prepare to bail out." "In this storm?" the navigator asked. "We can't see the ground." "We can't stay up here," Doolittle replied. "Autopilot on. Get out. That's an order." One by one, the men jumped into the void. The wind tore at them. It was freezing rain. They fell through the clouds, praying they wouldn't hit a mountainside before their chutes opened. Doolittle was the last to go. He looked at his cockpit one last time, the place that had kept him alive for 12 hours. He stepped into the hatch and let go. The darkness swallowed him. He landed in a rice paddy, submerged in foul-smelling water up to his waist. He cut his chute and waded to a muddy bank. He was alive, but he felt like a failure. In his mind, he had lost all 16 aircraft. He had accomplished nothing but a suicide stunt. He sat on a wet log, shivering, listening to the rain. "God," he whispered, "I hope the others made it." But not everyone did. Across the Chinese countryside, the other crews were scattered. Some crashed on the coast. 2 drowned. 1 died when his parachute failed. 8 men were captured by the Japanese. The Japanese army was furious, humiliated. They launched a massive search operation. They didn't just hunt the airmen. They hunted anyone who helped them. One pilot, Ted Lawson, had crashed hard. His leg was shredded, bone exposed. A young Chinese doctor, working with crude tools in a thatched hut, looked at him with sad eyes. "I have to take it," the doctor said in broken English, gesturing to the leg. "I'm a pilot," Lawson gasped, sweat pouring down his face. "I need my legs." "You need your life," the doctor said. Lawson nodded. He stuffed a rag in his mouth. There was no anesthesia. Doolittle eventually found the wreckage of his plane. It was a pile of aluminum scrap on a mountainside. He stood there, an older Chinese farmer next to him. "You strike Japan?" the farmer asked, pantomiming a bomb falling. Doolittle nodded. "Yes, we struck them." The farmer smiled. It was a grim smile, missing teeth. He reached out and shook Doolittle's hand. They didn't know it yet, but the raid had changed the war. Japan panicked. They pulled fighter squadrons back to defend the home islands. They launched a hasty, ill-conceived attack on Midway to extend their perimeter. That attack would become their doom. The Doolittle Raid pushed them into the mistake that lost them the war. But the cost was high. The Japanese army swept through the Chinese provinces that had sheltered the Americans. They burned villages. They contaminated wells. They executed civilians in the streets. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were slaughtered in retaliation for saving those 80 Americans. Doolittle made it home. He expected a court-martial for losing his planes. Instead, he was summoned to the White House. President Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest. "I didn't lose any men to the raid itself, Mr. President," Doolittle said quietly. "I lost them to the landing." "You gave us hope, Jimmy," Roosevelt said. "You proved they can bleed." The raid was a military pinprick, but psychologically it was a nuclear bomb. It shattered the myth of invincibility. It proved that no matter how far, no matter the odds, the enemy could be reached. War creates legends. It turns ordinary mechanics and pilots into giants. But it also creates ghosts. Of the 80 men who flew that day, most survived the war. But they never forgot the sound of those engines running dry over a dark, hostile continent. They never forgot the faces of the Chinese villagers who died to keep them hidden. Doolittle lived to be a general, but in his private moments, he always went back to that dark, rainy night in China, standing in the mud, believing he had failed. It reminds us that sometimes the line between disaster and victory is just a matter of enduring the crash. If you want more forgotten stories of real people who lived through WWII, please subscribe. This channel exists to bring their voices back. History isn't just dates and maps. It's the feeling of a steering yoke slick with sweat and a gas gauge reading empty. That was the Doolittle Raid. A mission that shouldn't have worked. A mission that changed the world.